Hello and welcome to Module 2, Unit 6, Stories as Data. I'm going to talk about the use of stories in health science research and practice. And a quick introduction, my name is Anna Genkova. I'm from UIC's Psychology Department, and I'm using stories for my dissertation project. The learning objective for today is to enable you to initiate your own storytelling project by understanding why we might want to use stories in health sciences and by understanding some of the methods and analytic approaches that we might want to take for working with stories. So, why stories? A main reason for using stories is to understand the lived experiences of living with risk or living with illness. What is it like to live with illness? What is it like to be a part of a vulnerable at-risk population? And you can imagine by understanding this better from a storytelling perspective, you can also gain an understanding as a practitioner or a researcher on how to better address risk or illness. Storytelling projects can be used as intervention by collecting stories or providing a space for people to tell their stories to one another. That might have healing effects for people who are living with illness. You might want to use stories to understand complex social problems, so the relationships between risk factors and protective factors that are not immediately clear from numeric data. Some people use them to understand how people make decisions about their health and how people make decisions about access to services, for example. And final use of stories is to educate people or promote advocacy, some type of policy. A brief overview of the storytelling methods that I have encountered. I have to say a caveat here that there's a lot of different methods and approaches. So I'm going to talk about these most common ones that I have seen. An oral history is an in-depth life account. It is co-produced with the researcher usually over a long period of time, sometimes multiple interviews. So life histories are maybe difficult to do, but fortunately there are a lot of archives either on the web or at libraries that you can access for your own research. Digital storytelling is a more accessible way for creating a storytelling project in health sciences. These are short snapshots of somebody's life that are documented using digital tools. You can even have the storyteller produce a PowerPoint or a video that portrays their story. And there is a couple of digital storytelling organizations, one of which we have partnered with for the Little Village Storytelling Project, and that's StoryCorps. There's also Story Center. So you can either initiate your own digital storytelling project, or you can connect with one of these organizations and use already recorded story collections. I put biographies in here, even though they're not as common in health sciences. But you can imagine you could use them if you want to understand how somebody's life had a big impact on population level health. A couple of the analytic approaches that I have seen with stories. One common one is narrative analysis. And usually you recognize narrative analysis because the product is a narrative. So you would analyze stories just like you would analyze a text in literature class. Um, the elements of character, plot, setting, climax resolution, and you would use those to produce a story. You can take a traditional qualitative analysis methods, such as thematic analysis or grounded theory. You could take interpretative approaches. These are similar to qualitative analysis in more traditional sense, but they're more constructivist. So I'm using constructivist grounded theory for my interpretations of the stories. And that means that I'm grounding my interpretation in with a particular theoretical lens. The critical race theory and a lot of other critical approaches use counter storytelling to elevate the voices of marginalized groups in research. And finally, there are communications approaches that focus not on what is said, but on the way of telling, how it is said. Within each of these analytic approaches, there is a wide variety of what people actually do. And it is best to browse through some storytelling projects to see, to get a feel of the different varieties. So if you want to start your own storytelling project, where do you start? I would say first, establish a goal and be able to articulate it. Think back to the reasons of why use stories and explain why stories are a good approach for your research questions. I would also suggest rooting yourself in a particular philosophical tradition, whether it's phenomenology, symbolic interactionism, narrative inquiry, critical race theory, or if you have a good reason for using a non-Western storytelling tradition, you can attempt that. Of course, it helps if you're from the culture in which that tradition emerged. So once you have those two steps, I would say the next thing would be to identify potential archives so that you don't have to do the recording of stories and archiving of stories on your own. Or at least identify partners such as storytelling organizations who can help you with your study. Storytelling projects present particular issues of ethics with the voice of people. You might be able to identify who they are. Stories are particular to individuals, so you might be able to identify even who they are by the events in their story. There are some tensions about who is analyzing the story, what the story is being used for. Are you honoring the voice and the story and the practice of storytelling if it's coming from a marginalized group? So attend to these more complex ethical issues that usually we don't engage with in numerical data. And then I put add your own here because I am looking always for more tips on my own storytelling project so we can connect and continue the conversation. And I end with a couple of resources that can help you get started. The first one is Uses of Oral History and Digital Storytelling in Public Health Research and Practice. So this is a review article where you can get a lot of citations about storytelling projects that were used in public health. Next, I have an example of critical race theory use of stories. I think about it all the time. A 12-year-old girl's internal crisis with racism and the effects on her mental health. So when I talked about critical race, deconstructing theory, constructivist approaches, this is a good example of an article that does that. Next, I have an example of a narrative approach, fictionalizing life stories. This was an interview that the author turned into a fictional narrative. And I would also suggest that you look up the works of Jerome Bruner and Jean Clandinin, because Clandinin, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but she is an author, a main author about narrative analysis. And Bruner, he has a lot of work, a body of work in storytelling analysis and the philosophical underpinning of stories.